Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Huge controversy going into the Mexico City Grand Prix with Lewis Hamilton revealing that multiple sources are telling him with 100% confidence that multiple other teams and drivers would have been disqualified from the US Grand Prix for illegal plank wear had their floors been checked by the FIA after the Grand Prix. This calls the entire farce situation into question, and also the FIA have responded to say they simply can't check all of the cars because it would take too much time. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. There is so much to get into today. We will begin with Red Bull. They have had a year of terrible suffering under the draconian 10% aero testing time penalty implemented based on the breach of the 2021 budget cap, and that has now expired. So Red Bull can go back to normal if there even has been any, we haven't really seen their penalty manifest itself in any way at all, and there's been lots of controversy as a result. That's now back to normal. They are immediately taking advantage actually by bringing, well, of course, they've planned this for some time, but they're bringing two new floor specifications for the 2024 season to Mexico City. They will run them over different practice sessions this weekend. So that's going to be very interesting. They need Perez not to crash, because what they really don't want to happen is Perez to crash and then the floor gets shown to the world, because this is very interesting. It shows how dominant Red Bull are, that they can afford to bring their upgrades aren't even for this car. They're simply experimental to see what's the best direction to go with next year's car. So, they might be stuck in 2 or 3 minds here, Red Bull. So it's interesting that they're not sure, okay, next year's floor is guaranteed to work in the way they want it to. They want to bring some ideas to this car and see how it goes. But yeah, that just shows the level of cushion that they have, and also shows that they've been working on the RB20 for a very long time. And I think the general feeling is it's going to be nigh on impossible for anyone to catch up to their car. Now, speaking of Red Bull, there was huge controversy again at the US Grand Prix that's actually been manifested after the fact based on track limits. Now, track limits is a topic at the moment that simply never goes away. And I don't know why it's always a Red Bull, but Andreas here from AMUS says that during the Grand Prix, Perez was seen, and potentially other drivers, cutting turn 6 way too often. Turns out there was a CCTV camera that was in the wrong position, so the stewards actually couldn't see this during the race and track it. But apparently Perez went inside of so technically outside of track limits, but the track limit is this white line here on the left. This is not the track limit because this is the curb. The track limit is here. The drivers know this full well, but Perez was doing this and wasn't getting caught for doing this, so he kept on doing it. And Red Bull weren't telling anyone that he was doing it. This would gain you a bit of time by cutting the corner, and you can drive on this curb successfully and get away with it, but it's it's not allowed. It's outside of track limits. So it has been noted that Perez went outside of this white line 26 times during the Grand Prix. And if you add that up with, the way it works, black and white flag, then the penalties start coming in, that would be roughly 75 seconds of time penalties if they were to apply them now, which would put him outside of the points. So, it's just one of those things, because Hamilton comes in, he obviously beats Perez in the sprint, gets some points on the board towards the fight for P2 in the championship. Hamilton then gets disqualified, very marginally, as we'll see in a second, and Perez gets a good result, even promoted based on Hamilton's disqualification, and gets to keep his result, even though he went outside track limits so many times. Even Rasmus here looked into this and literally found every single screenshot of the occasions where Perez is outside. Now, for example, some of these, his front tyres might be outside, the rear tyres might not be, so there might not be quite 26, but there's a lot. Look at all these screenshots here. Some of these, he's so far outside track limits, it's not even funny, but apparently they didn't even notice or really care. So why is it always a Red Bull is the question that I have to answer. But anyway, the Red Bulls got away with that weekend, and it's Leclerc and Hamilton that get disqualified for the Grand Prix. Leclerc was disqualified for a few tenths of a millimetre. The plank was worn by Lewis Hamilton. The figure that we're hearing is 0.05 millimetres. So the plank is allowed to wear, I believe, in the 2 areas they check it, by 1 millimetre. Hamilton's plank was worn by an extra, 5% over that, which is very marginal. If you guys are wondering, because these numbers don't mean anything to the human brain, but 0.05 millimeters is on the lower bound of what you'd expect, like an A4 sheet of paper. So if you grab a piece of paper as thin as it really ever gets, that's what you're going to be, that's pretty much what we're talking about. So these are some fine measuring implements, but it's a very minor failure that Mercedes have, or disqualification over the limit. And look, this is interesting for Mercedes because they will think, well, it's not like they were massively abusing the floor height and everything, so the performance of the car was probably legitimate, at least in parts. Yes, Red Bull were probably sacrificing some performance by ensuring that the floor was raised, but it was interesting to hear that Leclerc said that in practice and stuff, they didn't really have any of these issues. And Hamilton did say, actually, as we'll see in a second here, during when he discusses that other teams should have got disqualified, that his opinion is that they should be able to change the plank between the sprint and the race, because they do the sprint and there's a bit of wear on it, but they're not allowed to change that before the Grand Prix because it's under Parc Fermé, which is probably not really a good thing about the sprint conditions. Like, if they were allowed to change it, then they'd have probably been fine for the Grand Prix. And it feels like there does need to be some changes there, because this season, with more sprint races and more races in general, they upped the allocation of engine parts, especially ICEs, from 3 to 4. So you'd think there's maybe a similar kind of change needs to be made to allocate for sprint races in this particular circumstance. Now, the other controversy, of course, is that these plank wear checks are done randomly, but yet these are the numbers of how many have been done so far this season. Now, look, if you guys are into statistics, this type of stuff falls in the realms of possibility for a random selection, but it doesn't feel random. When you look at this, you look at the fact that, the top teams really are the ones that seem to be getting checked the most. Okay, Red Bull are at 2. Now, Hamilton, I believe, has 2 of these 5. Russell has 3. But still, Mercedes have 5 plank wear checks this year. Ferrari have 5. Then it goes to 2 for Red Bull, Haas, Alfa Romeo and McLaren. Then it's 1 each for Alpine and Aston Martin, and none at all for Williams and AlphaTauri. So, as I say, it's possible in a statistical sample that you could see stuff like this, but it doesn't look right, does it? If you want to try and pretend that it's random and it's fair, you would think that they should try and even these out somewhat, because people are going to look at this and they're going to think, well, they keep testing Mercedes and Ferrari to try and catch them out. They're not testing the other teams as much. Now, look, is there a big, conspiracy about this? I'm not convinced, but it doesn't look good, and this is what the drivers are having to say. So Hamilton commented on this, and obviously he was frustrated getting disqualified, but he went on to discuss how about the other cars that were illegal during the Grand Prix, because, okay, he was very marginally over in terms of plank wear, so was Charles Leclerc, but they only tested 4 cars. They tested, very interestingly, the 3 podium sitters and the pole sitter, the 3 podium finishers in the pole sitter, which doesn't feel random, if you're going to tell me that it's random, which is what they seem to suggest is the case. So Hamilton says that multiple sources have told him that there were plenty of other cars that would have been disqualified for the same thing.
They only tested a few cars and 50% of them got disqualified. There are far more drivers' cars that were illegal. The sport really had such an amazing weekend, such a great turnout and a great race, and then every time we take steps forward within the sport, something like that really taints it. So I think we've got to do something. Hopefully they'll learn a little bit from the future, rather than checking everybody and over 50% of the cars failing, which I would put all my money on it that they would have. Instead, maybe, for example, if we're having a sprint race, maybe we should be able to change just the skid, for example, or the floor, whatever it is, on the Saturday night. So on Sunday you don't have this ridiculous kind of event afterwards.
I do wonder as well whether the primary sources that are telling him might be within his own team, because Mercedes will know whether Russell was over the limit as well. And you'd imagine the first people whispering in Hamilton's ear that, other cars might have been disqualified could have been his own team. But they weren't tested. Russell wasn't tested. He gets to keep the position, even though it's very likely, I would say, that Russell's floor and Sainz's floor were also worn by that level. Now, it's not a major performance advantage by smashing the floor into the ground. Obviously, running the car as low as possible is good, and Hamilton was saying that mainly it's just because some cars ride the bumps better than others with their suspension, and therefore Mercedes gets caught out more by that, even if they aren't necessarily really pushing the limits of what's possible in terms of ride height. So, that statement made me think that, probably Russell was also in that position, and he says that multiple people have told him that, loads of other ones would have been illegal as well, which is probably what we'd have expected, but it's still fascinating nonetheless that there were plenty of cars that finished that Grand Prix on last Sunday that if they were all tested, would have been disqualified. I mean, let's be honest, 50% of the cars that were tested were disqualified. Apply that to the rest of the grid, and you've got maybe half the points finishes are actually legal cars, technically at the end of the Grand Prix, which, sure, those are the rules of the way it works. Okay, if the plank's worn too much, it's a disqualification. But, you know, that would have been massively farcical, right? It was already kind of farcical enough that Hamilton and Leclerc got disqualified in the way that they did. The idea that, like, half the grid could have been DQ'd, it's an awful view for the sport, really. Somebody finishes the race and wins. Have they won? Is their floor plank worn too much? It's just not a good look in general. And they've got to figure this out, either by testing all the cars or by thinking about, all right, on sprint weekends, maybe we've got to change around these rules somewhat to prevent this from happening as often as it potentially could on a circuit as bumpy as Austin. It's not like this happens massively often, but you got to wonder, like, how many cars have finished Grand Prix this season that have had an illegal amount of floor wear, but it's just not been tested, so nobody knows. And, this is the point that Hamilton's trying to get across. The other drivers, of course, agreed. They were like, look, more cars should have been tested. I'm sure that Norris would have liked to see Russell's car tested. I'm sure that he would like to have seen Sainz's car tested, neither of which was the case, and I'm sure there could have been plenty of other drivers as well. Verstappen was fine. Was Perez fine? We don't know. He was driving all over the curbs, as we saw a second ago. Maybe there's a possibility that his floor was worn more as well, but it simply wasn't tested, so we don't know. Even Verstappen said that if one car is illegal, the other car should be checked, which seems perfectly sensible. Or you just try and check every car. Now, of course, you can't check everything on every car all the time after every Grand Prix. That is implausible, but there's got to be a better way to do it than the way we're currently seeing, especially when the FIA come out and say, well, actually, it's simply impossible to check everything. So, unlucky Hamilton, you got caught out this time, as did Leclerc. But, maybe if you were luckier next time, you wouldn't have been selected, and therefore you'd have kept your podium. It's like, what do you mean it's impossible to check every component? Now, sure, it is, time-wise, not really plausible to do this. And to be honest, some of the blame here from the FIA is going to Formula 1 because they say that there's simply too many Grand Prix. So as they say here, the FIA says that practical aspects have to be taken into account when it comes to checking cars. In conducting these tests, a huge amount of work goes on in the limited time available after a Grand Prix finishes and before the cars need to be returned to their teams for disassembly and transportation to the next race. However, even though a wide array of checks are made, it is impossible to cover every parameter of every car in the short time available, and this is especially true of back-to-back race weekends when freight deadlines must also be considered. So they're basically saying, we don't have the time to check all these things, so we'll check a few cars and that'll be it. I think their intention is to ensure that by randomly checking, they will ensure that teams aren't intentionally trying to breach the rules, because they will occasionally find teams that are breaching it, but it's like, it doesn't feel fair that certain drivers get selected in a way that also doesn't necessarily feel random as well, and then their teammates that maybe also are liable, or the rest of the grid also weren't checked. I mean, yeah, it's a massive mess, really. And it is one with severe and serious implications. Now, Hamilton was also going on about Checo Perez, obviously talking about Perez at his home Grand Prix, and saying that Red Bull simply aren't supportive of Perez, actually saying that they haven't given him enough support. He actually specifically said that, I won't say the team, there's a lot of members in the team, but there is one particular spokesperson that has not really been that great in helping psychologically. I wonder who he could possibly be talking about here on the right-hand side. And as he says, if I heard Toto talking negatively about me on the weekends, it would be very tough. So I think that Hamilton makes a very fair point here, really. It can't be good for Perez. It can't be helpful to his career when Helmut Marko is saying all this stuff about him as a driver and, how he's been falling short of expectations, etc., etc. And then when he says one weekend, oh yeah, Perez, he's got a seat for next year, no problem at all. And then 2 weekends later, Helmut Marko is saying, actually, no, it's not guaranteed. He's got to turn up the heat and actually deliver a good result. It can't be great. This is what happens at Red Bull. It's a pressure cooker. You know how it is. And I thought it was, interesting and probably nice words from Hamilton to say, given the circumstances. But because Hamilton said it, he was catching a lot of criticism, as tends to pretty much always be the case. Quickly on Red Bull as well, because they are bringing their car this weekend again, and they're bringing their experimental flaws. The brake issues that Verstappen had, they don't know what caused them. Of course, I guess they'll change the brakes, so they're not the same as last week's one, but they're sending them back to the factory to try and understand. But they they didn't finish the Grand Prix Red Bull and immediately think, oh, okay, it was that. It was, some issue with the brakes that was causing the problem for Max. They don't know what that was. So they're sending them back to the factory to get that analysed. But it does mean that there's maybe a chance that it's some underlying issue that could reoccur if they don't understand exactly where that's coming from. So it might not be an issue this weekend's Mexican Grand Prix, but if it is, then the door will most certainly be open. Maybe to Ferrari, but possibly unlikely. They were losing 7-8 tenths of a second last year in race pace because their engine couldn't cope with the altitude and the lack of air coming into, I think it's especially the turbo. But they've decided against an engine change in Mexico. They could do one. They might well need another one. They probably will take a penalty at some point, but Mexico is not it. So maybe Brazil, maybe Las Vegas if they think they can, just pass cars because of that massive back DRS straight. I also saw this a few days ago and I thought, nah, there's no way. But now there's an AMUS article talking about it, and this is about Audi's Formula 1 project. They're coming in 2026, partnering with Sauber. Or are they? Apparently, there is friction on the board as to whether they actually want to do this. I think some new CEO or something who has a different opinion on the Formula 1 project and isn't particularly convinced that it's a good idea. So, yeah, don't know what you guys think about this, but Sauber, Audi, is meant to be a thing very soon. And apparently, Audi are now having second thoughts on coming into Formula 1, which would be a big exit if they decided to make it. Would, not be good for their image and would cost the company $1 billion. But it might be what they do. So stay tuned for that. Another very near disaster miss this weekend. There's lots of these in Formula 1. I mean, last year especially, Suzuka, the tractor, Gasly, after Sainz's spin, could have been bad. And every year we get something stupid that happens. And this is another example. I mean, even Baku this year, right? When the pit lane and Ocon was coming in for his pit stop and all the guys were there. Yeah, shambles. And every time they say, oh yeah, we're going to look into that. We're going to make sure that nothing like this dangerous ever happens again. This weekend, I don't know how this is possible, as Bryson points out, that here's a helicopter filming the action and they start to set off fireworks on the helicopter. Well, okay, not knowing the helicopter's there, but the fireworks start going off and you can actually, they actually hit the helicopter here and fair play to the pilot getting out of there. But yeah, I don't know who made this cock up really to launch the fireworks with the helicopter in this position. Whether there was some miscommunication, I don't know. But this could have been, yeah, seriously bad. And I don't even know what the point of these fireworks was because it was still daytime. We couldn't see them anyway. So yeah, that was a bad one. And they've got to think about exactly what caused this because, yeah, another near miss on an F1 weekend. There seem to be one or two a year at this point. And eventually it's going to end in disaster, you've got to think. If it keeps on going in this direction. Carlos Sainz was also unwell yesterday, so he didn't attend the media day and stuff. Ferrari say that he's going to be back in the car today. And yeah, practice begins for the Mexico City Grand Prix in very short order as well. So very much interested your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.